more on what to expect as those talks get underway. I'm joined in studio by our Chief Foreign Editor, Rob Parsons. Rob, talk us through it. What expectations are there coming from today's meeting?
Well, the expectations are pretty low, it has to be said. You know, there was a meeting, as you pointed out, a couple of weeks ago, also in Turkey, between the foreign ministers of the two countries. It was a pretty angry meeting by all accounts. Not much, if any, progress was made. This time round, I think perhaps because it was such an explosive meeting the last time round, they've decided to hold it at a slightly lower level, at presidential advisor level. But there's no expectation, really, that anything is going to come out of this. Beyond the fact that they are talking to each other, that in itself is regarded at least as a positive sign. President Erdogan pushing, he's been playing quite a positive role in the whole negotiation process, trying to get something out of it, hoping obviously that this will reflect well on Turkey if something does emerge. But at this stage, it has to be said that despite the fact that the Ukrainians are a little bit more ready, it seems, to move on the issue of neutrality. We've heard over the last few days them saying that they're prepared for the possibility of neutrality as long as it is given international guarantees by states like the United States, United Kingdom and others. Possibly too ready to move on the issue of language status for Russian in Ukraine, although that's not very clear yet. And also as just a hint by President Zelensky of Ukraine that he was prepared to consider some sort of arrangement for those separatist provinces supported by the Russians in the east, in Luhansk and Donetsk. But again, not very clear. But as for the Russians at this stage, you know, for the very reason that they're not doing well on the battlefront, it seems really unlikely that they're going to accept a ceasefire or any sort of progress in the talks. They're just not ready for it at the moment. They want to see more progress from their side in the fighting, I think, before they'll be ready to consider talking seriously to the Ukrainians.
And Rob, we can see those talks underway on the screen here behind us. One of those supposedly at those negotiations in Turkey is Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich. He's the subject of a very strange allegation emerging in the US on Monday. Yeah,
very strange story, this one. Roman Abramovich apparently has been taking part in back talks with the Ukrainians. He was at a meeting allegedly on the 3rd to 4th of March with another Russian and 2 Ukrainian MPs. 3 of them apparently were poisoned by a chemical weapon of some kind. It is suggested by at least one source that for several hours Abramovich was blinded. He had to be taken to a hospital in Istanbul where he was treated. He recovered. He had other symptoms like burning pains in his eyes. His skin was peeling. And obviously, you know, given the Russians' reputation in the area of chemical weapons usage in the past, the suspicion has fallen on the Russians. The suggestion is that this, if it was the Russians, if it was a chemical weapon, and there are some who doubt it, if it was, that it was a small dosage intended to send a warning to those taking part, particularly the Russians, from the Russian side, not to advance too far on the peace front, but to hold back. The Americans, it has to be said, pouring cold water on the story. They're saying that it might have been caused by some environmental factor. That's highly doubted by most experts. But the reason why the Americans might be throwing cold water on this is that if the Russians did indeed use a chemical weapon, that might be all that's needed to push the Americans into taking further steps in the conflict in Ukraine, getting involved to a greater extent. They don't want to do that. That's the last thing they want at this stage. So they're trying to play this down.
Particularly after Joe Biden's comments at the weekend, we can presume. Rob, the Ukrainians going into these talks, they were kind of saying their one cause for hope is the fact that Russia appears to be doing so badly on the ground in Ukraine. Tell us a little bit about the situation there.
Well, you know, from the point of view of the survival of the Ukrainian state, it is a cause of hope. From the point of view, as I was just suggesting, of the talks in Istanbul, it pretty much means that they're not going to go anywhere for a while until the Ukrainians have firmly established to the Russians that they're not going to make any progress anytime, never mind in the next few days, the next few weeks, that it's just not going to happen. We've seen the Russians talking about moving to a second phase in this conflict, concentrating their forces on one axis in the eastern part of Ukraine, in those two republics I was talking about, Donetsk and Luhansk, and trying to expand beyond that and bringing down forces from the north, Kharkiv, and from the south around Mariupol. They're a long way from achieving that yet, it has to be said, but their aim, presumably, is to surround the Ukrainian forces who are in that area fighting against Russian troops already in those two republics. The Ukrainians, though, it has to be said, are being very successful about preventing the redeployment of Russian troops. They're forcing them to stick to those multiple axes, fighting them in the area northwest of Kyiv and to the east of Kyiv, achieving some successes, gaining control, was mentioned earlier on the programme, of the small town of Irpin, but also progressing towards Hostomel, where there's a military airport, Bucha, taking control of Makariv, and threatening to surround Russian forces in that area. And in the south, too, progress around Mykolaiv, pushing the Russians back by about 60 kilometers from there, and reducing the threat, in other words, to the port city of Odessa on the Black Sea, which at the moment seems not to be threatened at all. But in the north as well, around Kharkiv, around Sumy, progress by the Ukrainians. So everywhere at the moment, apart from the southern city of Mariupol, the Ukrainians seem to be doing pretty well. In Mariupol, the situation is catastrophically dire. According to the mayor of the city, 5,000 civilians have died there already in 3 weeks of this siege, over 200 children, and no sign that things are going to get better. The Russians have the city completely surrounded, and the likelihood is that at some stage during the next few days, perhaps a bit longer, the city could fall to the Russians. That could have a big impact on the way the conflict develops in eastern Ukraine.
And how those negotiations go, of course, in Turkey.
Exactly.
Rob Parsons, our Chief Foreign Editor, thank you so much for joining us with that update.